This podcast is brought to you by Humans, the next generation HRIS supporting distributed organizations globally.
Sharon, thanks very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm massively excited. As I said, we're just at the very beginning of this journey with the pod, and I need to get used to it a little bit. So there is definitely a sense of discomfort, but I think, together we can navigate that.
You're doing great.
So I'm massively excited.
Same.
So we can start a little bit with your story. So maybe you can tell more about, who you are and, what's your background, what's your story, and of course, how you ended up in, the wonderful world of, people and HR.
Yeah, thank you. So I work for a company called Osome, and we're a finance business for accountants and bookkeeping. It was a company created by an entrepreneur himself, Victor, for entrepreneurs. So it was all around how do we make life easier for entrepreneurs, takes them away from what we call the boring stuff, which is all the finance stuff, and lets them focus on business, the things that they actually love doing. Prior to Osome, I was at a global company, data and insights company called Essential, which was amazing. I spent 4.5 years there. Again, very different. We're at 500 people at Osome there. It was like in the thousands. And then prior to that, I've been in various industries, different size businesses, but always within HR. And I think if I think about the thread that ties all these companies together, it was always about the opportunity, about being a part of something, the change, taking something from A to B, something in its infancy to growing something. So I'm a problem solver. I just love getting into something and being a part of change. But within the people space, I think I've worked across pretty much all spectrums within, all the specialisms from talent acquisition, HR operations, culture, diversity and inclusion, pretty much all of it. And I think, I don't know if that just comes from growing up. I'm from a very, very big family, which I've loved. So I've always been around people and community. I love connections. So I think for me, it was just, I just love being with people. And I think the sort of later on more so, I think I've just been very fascinated with and curious with human behavior and just working with people. So yeah, that's kind of like how I think just pretty much I've been in HR from the beginning, but just working in different specialisms within HR.
Amazing. Thanks very much for sharing. We're going to dive a little bit into the topic of inclusivity today. I know that you've been at a number of incredible organizations, especially focused on global organization, global scaling. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more of what you observe specifically in the segment, and also what inclusivity is actually, for you.
I think in simple terms, just to include. I think, everyone talks about, we just want people to feel welcome, treated with respect and fairly. And I think definitely it is that, but I think it's a bit deeper than that in the sense of, how safe are we making people feel when they arrive? I have been on the other side as well, as someone from a diverse background myself. And I think about sort of my lived experiences as well. But I think it genuinely is about how safe do we make people feel in the workplace, but also then on top of that, what barriers are we removing for them along the way as well? So I think that's super important as well. I think, it's lived behavior. It's not just saying that we're inclusive. It's about, okay, so what are you doing to make people feel safe and included and respected and celebrated, etc.?
In the last 10 years, in particular, maybe the last 3 to 5, let's say, we've seen a massive level of change in the people space. So we went from a global pandemic, working from home, and then we've seen companies scaling extremely fast, especially in the tech space, and obviously they had an impact on hiring strategy, for example, talent retention, talent acquisition, and then we've seen obviously the dark side of it with the layoffs and all the change. What have you observed? You have gone through kind of a number of those journeys and situations, but is there anything specific that you observe in changes and specific behavior and approach that companies have got around the topic of inclusivity given those situations?
I think a lot more now is people-led. I think if I think back to, companies before, it was very much what they set the tone. But I think now, people are demanding a lot more as well. There's so much social awareness around it. People have a sense of responsibility. Candidates are demanding for companies to be taking the lead in this as well. So I think, the pandemic in particular, there were some heavy topics that came. What does the future of work look like from a flexible working? The diversity and inclusion after the unfortunate death of George Floyd in particular sparked a lot of conversations within businesses as well. And then most recently, it's things like AI and mental health's a big thing right now. Everyone I'm talking to in particular, whether that's in sort of workplaces or outside of work, mental health is a big topic that's being covered. So, but one thing I would say is, so as much as like things have changed but people are still people. I think, when you think about, what do people want in all the time I've been in HR, it's still the fact that they want to work a part of good cultures, good managers, want to do great, meaningful work. They want to be paid fairly. They want career opportunities. So that hasn't changed massively, but I think it is the spark of what people want has definitely sparked a lot of conversation now in the workplace.
And have you seen companies approaching that differently depending on the level of maturity, stage of growth, or how do you see that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, where I say, if I think about from a candidate perspective now, millennials and Gen Zs in particular, they are demanding. I was one of those people, for me, it was a non-negotiable. I don't expect companies to have solved it because I don't think anyone has. It's a journey, but I needed them to care about this topic. And I think, so if you look at it from candidate perspective, the fact that we're operating in global companies, so we also represent, our clients and customers as well. There's a story actually that where it goes wrong, when companies don't take diversity seriously. I remember when I was living in the US, I came across a story which was called the racist soap dispenser. And what it was typically, this product was built so, if I was to put my hand under the soap dispenser, it wouldn't work because I had darker skin tone. And, that sparked a lot of thought for me, which was around, thinking about from the design to build to the testing, everything. There was no people of colour during that process. So it actually ended up being really bad, not just from a PR perspective, but the company would have lost a lot of money on the back of that. So again, I think diversity, those conversations, having those people, is so important, but I think people are demanding it more. And I think that's the change that I've seen massively.
And everything, of course, starts with hiring. So how do you think about the first step there and the piece of work that is required to make sure that you have a strong hiring infrastructure and hiring process that can enable you to kind of, tap into the right pool of talent and obviously start to kind of, incentivize the right behavior from day one?
Yeah, I think the first thing is making sure your house is in order, which is that have you created that right environment? There's nothing worse than bringing people into a culture where you haven't solved, your stance on sort of that inclusion. Then I think the objective hiring thing is the way forward. We've all got unconscious bias. There's no denying that. But I think typically what happens, and I've been there through similarity bias in particular, and we end up hiring for sort of our needs rather than the team needs or the business needs or culture needs or whatever it may be. So I think, hiring in itself is a big topic, but I think, again, we have to make sure that we're managing expectations of the candidate. We are having an objective hiring process. We're holding managers, the hiring manager and recruiters accountable. We're reaching out to those diverse communities in particular. I think that's the key thing in all of this. You have to be proactive. I've worked with so many credible people that, have really good intent of making a change in this space, but the action doesn't follow, unfortunately, and that's really got to align. So again, it has to be a proactive approach, and it is something that you have to get your house in order first and then attract those people.
And is always top down in your view?
Always. I've been on the other side and I've been on the leadership side as well. And honestly, I can't stress enough, those people, leaders are holding the power here. You're the ones that can set the tone. I've been in companies where, I personally didn't feel safe, and I think now that I am on the other side where I'm part of the leadership team, it's 18 months worth of work, but we've really set the tone. And I think that was something our non-negotiable as a business. It came from the top. We created those policies in place, the safe spaces. I'm really proud that, we've got in the race and ethnicity, for example, over 90% of people have provided us their data, which, again, I never take for granted because I know people don't just give you their data. You know, they have to feel safe to give you that. So I think, you know, it has to be top down, because ultimately those people are the ones holding the power. We can talk about it all that we want, we want equal rights, we want this, but the reality is it's people from the top that are going to set the tone.
I mean, in general, if people want to prioritize specific initiatives, they will find a way and the time to kind of, you know, invest. But something that we've seen, especially in the last, let's say, 18 months, 24 months, things were getting very tough for companies. Like the climate in the public market has been very challenging, especially when you look at the venture type business. Raising money has been very tough. So everyone started to focus more aggressively on a sustainable growth. How do we drive revenue growth for the business, and maybe deprioritizing a number of activity where they felt, okay, this is not necessarily as high of a priority. So how do you think about that? Like when things are obviously healthy and the market is in a really good shape, we've seen more of new things coming and new initiatives being prioritized. But when the goal is the company is at risk, we need to take ruthless measure to make sure that we can actually survive. What have you seen in the context?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. I think, you know, to a few years ago where there was this big recruitment drive, and now actually people are just not recruiting. You know, we too are going through funding rounds, etc. as well, and it's a process. You know, it is scale up in general. Startups is a different type. You know, it takes a different type of person. I think, you know, you have to be so comfortable with uncertainty, lack of structure. You've got to be a risk taker. And I think that's where, when you are hiring, it is about managing those expectations. You know, people are making life decisions, and we have to make sure we've been really open and honest with people. We've got our employee value proposition in place. You know, we're objectively hiring those people that are right for the business, because again, performance is a big thing. I mean, that's a topic in itself. But again, if you don't get hire the right people for the business and the growth, it can really, you know, one person can change the whole dynamic of a business, especially when you are in a smaller business. You rely on that one person to make a big impact. So again, it is making sure that you're hiring the right people against what you need for the role, the business, and not your own needs again as well.
Something that I've seen you know, happen a few times in the past, where companies that manage to attract a very diverse pool of talent, where diverse can be based on opinions, but also cultural differences. There might be characteristics and ways in which people kind of, you know, behave. They're just you know, part of the way they are, right? For example, if I'm a person that is more direct and spontaneous, that might be perceived as, again, more of aggressive, perhaps in some context, for someone that is not familiar or is not used to the level of, you know, directness there. So how companies can approach those topics? Like, how do you make sure that everybody's feeling that you can have a nice dialogue, even if, again, your previous experience, cultural background, or anything that you have around you that kind of, you know, shape the way you are, is actually not the way you intend actually to behave, but you've never had, you know, the opportunity to say, actually, I'm doing something wrong here, but I'm not realizing it. So how do you feel? But again, it's a very loaded question perhaps, but you tell me a little bit how, you know, if you got any experiences there, or what's your view?
Yeah, I think it is. Adaptability as a manager or a leader is so important. I think, you know, we are at service to the people that we manage, and we just have to recognize that everyone has different needs. So a really good question that I think is really helpful to ask for me, you know, I always ask the people that I hire is, you know, how do you like to be managed? I think that really helps. And we've got this something actually we've launched. It's all around setting, because people aren't always great, we assume, and we're not great at the communication. So we've got something that gets sent out on the first day of the individual joining. So which is all around, first, the inclusion part is like, you know, what reasonable adjustments do you need? Like, you know, do you have a preference on when you prefer one-to-ones and all these things? Because we have to remember people have lives outside, you know, they might have commitments such as, you know, childcare or looking after a parent or whatever it may be. So that's the inclusion part of removing those barriers. But then it's about, how do you like to be communicated? What's your direct, you know, what's your style of feedback? And I think just because, you know, there's that saying, isn't there, treat others how you want to be treated, but actually it's more around how does the individual want to be treated? So it's really understanding about, you know, what's your preference on receiving feedback? How do you like it? And then adapting accordingly. I think if you've got that sort of foundation of shared respect and those values, etc., I think that's half of the battle, because you'll know the intent is there, the good intent is there. It's just about styles more so. And again, coming from a big family, I think that really helped me. Everyone's got great intent. They're great people, but all of our styles are very, very different. So it's just really understanding each other's needs.
And you think that it's always about, kind of a bespoke approach, or is there kind of some sort of baseline template that you can use and say, okay, let's get it right. So this is the way I can approach giving feedback, but then I can tweak a few aspects of it. Like how would you advise me to do, let's say, if I want to get better at giving feedback? Well,
it's preferences, isn't it? It's first us understanding that person's preferences. But I think if you go back to the common goal, we're here to deliver. It's a business. So this is my role. And so we've got that as a mutual, this is what we're here to do. So we've got the same goal. Okay, so talk me through it. And I think I always lead every conversation with curiosity. I never assume. I don't try and judge. I literally go in, like, let's break it down. Let's work backwards. Okay, can you tell me a little bit about that? Why did that happen? Okay. And then it's just about, advising and guiding. I think people, I don't think people are difficult. I don't think anyone goes out of their way to be difficult, but I think it is just the misalignment or preferences that we get wrong. So for me, it genuinely is, going into every conversation with genuine curiosity, understanding that person and the preferences, and then adapting my style accordingly. But I there's no right and wrong, because again, it comes back to the other individual, because we also have to remember they're humans. It could really impact them, the sensitivity side, it could knock their confidence. We just don't know where people are at. So I think it's so important just to understand, where were they coming at? What was their sort of level of, thinking of when they did something. So just remembering that they're human at the end of it. And I think the key thing I always talk about in performance conversations in particular is, just think about, there's going to be two outcomes of this conversation. One, it's either someone's going to leave feeling really disengaged and unmotivated, or they're going to go away feeling engaged. And now how I approach it is I'll always do it through examples, again, keeping it very objective. It's not by feeling what I think of the individual. I go in it very much based on, let's talk about this situation rather than the person, and then I tackle it that way to ensure people are leaving hopefully a bit more positive.
On this topic of performance, I think is in a number of cases can be a little bit difficult, especially if you need to provide direct feedback on something that is just not working right. And there can be, again, a performance conversation, or can be, someone said something in a way that maybe was not appropriate. So like, how do you go about approaching the conversation and provide feedback in a way that is, again, constructive, healthy, and perceived obviously in a way that is as human as we can, really, but when the topic is very difficult to approach, and some people will feel uncomfortable in approaching the topic.
Mm-hmm. I think it's being objective, not getting personal about the person. It's not about you did this, it's like the outcome of what happened, and maybe we can think about different ways. I think feedback's so hard. I'm being on the other side, and it's never comfortable receiving it, but also giving it's just as hard. But one thing that I've learned in particular is the outcome. How do I want to get this, how do I want this conversation to go? And I think the impact it's had. So if for example, someone did something in it and, was really badly delivered in the business, etc. And then you could be like, hey, like, obviously this happened. Let's talk about it. Like what happened, etc. Going at place on curiosity and saying, okay, well, this is the impact it had. So let's talk about that. Again, I go into more solutions rather than sort of telling someone off. It's about how did they learn from that experience, and what are we going to change going forward, rather than focusing so much, because sometimes people just genuinely don't know. And I think that's something we have to recognise as well. They wouldn't know potentially. So we have to go in with the curiosity and then say, look, this is kind of what I would expect. We might have failed. I think that's something, as leaders, that sometimes you could have failed. You might not have been clear enough in the direction as well. So we have to take some accountability in that as well. But I think a lot of it is having respect in that conversation. I think that's the key thing. As long as someone can see that you're coming at it with good intent and it's not personal, it's actually about the situation rather than the person, I think that is half of the battle.
Massively value you sharing there. That's very, very helpful. Going back to this climate component that we discussed a little bit, where You see companies that might need to pay it in a different way. Something that I was thinking about as I was preparing for this conversation was this aspect of top-down approach to company building versus bottom-up approach. Like when I think about inclusivity, for me a big component is people need to feel valued, right? So they need to feel that they are contributing and they can be part of some decisions. And that again can be a little bit easier if the company is going extremely well, where you can collect more feedback, let's say, from people and more opinions, and you can actually drive those conversations forward. But when things can be a little bit tough, or if you're in a more competitive space and you need to take a more aggressive approach, you might not present the opportunity to kind of absorb more of the feedback. So how would you think about that? Like what's the best way for companies perhaps to kind of if they've got different style and operate in different markets to kind of approach taking the feedback from the employees and absorbing the feedback, or providing feedback in the right time, in the right way, when things actually maybe can't be taken into consideration?
Yeah, it's got to be in the moment feedback. There's nothing worse than a year later saying, can you remember you did this 11 months ago? By then people have moved on, even from last week. So I think it has got to be really timely. Again, because people assume that they're doing a great job and then you hit them with something they did 10, 11 months ago. That's pretty bad. But I think in the moment feedback, and one thing in particular that I feel has really helped our team, the people team in particular, it is in the moment feedback through different means. So when at every touch point, so whether that's new starter surveys, exit surveys, whether that's anniversary interviews, you've been here a year, tell me about it, how's it going, etc. It's from engagement surveys, focus groups is something I love doing, because you really, there's one thing of receiving it through, data, and that's really helpful to theme it and get insights. But what I love is being on the ground with people and really understanding the why. Like, why did that happen? And then from there, you learn so much about the business, which could be about the product, which could be about other teams, etc. So I think, not having that information in the moment could actually also impact business growth. So that's one of the things that I really love doing is spending time with people. And that's something I've not lost. I still very much stay on the ground with people to try and understand, what are the challenges in order for product and all those spaces to close the gap a little bit, because again, we have to remember people are not always just going to give the feedback, especially the sort of cultures that I work with as well. We've got a majority of our employees in Asia. Culturally, they operate very differently as well. So they're not always the most forward in coming openly with feedback, etc. as well. So that's where we have to create those spaces and really get that feedback through different means as well.
Amazing. Thanks very much for sharing that. So we are at the very beginning of the year still. So what do you anticipate for this 2024?
God, it's so heavy right now, the world, it feels. There's just so much conversation. There's a lot being talked about in the HR space in particular. I feel like we're still talking about diversity and inclusion, and action's not necessarily following at the speed it could. I think the topic of big stay is something that's happening right now. A lot of people, because of the uncertainty in the market and in environments, people are moving less. So what happens is people are typically staying in companies longer, but they may not be motivated or engaged, and that could be impacting business performance as well. I think mental health is a big one. I think, the surveys we're doing, or when I'm speaking to peer groups externally or friends and family, I think that the one topic that keeps coming up is mental health. I think that's going to be a big one for this year as well. But yeah, I think from our perspective, it is probably going to be around well-being of employees in particular.
And we're getting towards the end of the pod. As we wrap up, are there any resources that you would suggest, or things that you would share if companies want to get better, people want to get better, want to improve, learn more about these topics? Is there anything you would suggest there?
There's so many. I think we're not short of resources at all, but I think for me personally, I think my biggest source is the people that I interact with, my circles. And I don't mean just diversity in characteristics, but also diversity of thought. I feel like I learn so much through the people that I get to hang out with. I think the other thing, from a more formal base, I think Bell Hooks is by far my favourite author, but because she covers so much from things like culture, inclusion, feminism, gender, race, everything. So I think from a book's perspective, it's her. Podcast, I would say probably The Diary of a CEO. And most recently, I would say probably What Now by Trevor Noah. And then I would say on Instagram, I think a really good page to follow, especially for someone from the South Asian community in particular. It's the Pink Laddu Project. Again, a lot around identity. And quite a political one, but Nova Media, I think, is really good, because if you work in HR, you've got to understand how policies are embedded into HR. So again, how if you understand the landscape of politics as well, you'll understand how that translates into the workplace. I'm very fascinated by politics because it does have a knock-on effect on people and their lives and the policies. And I think we just got to move away from being so rigid with policies and have more of a human approach and based on principles and character rather than policies. So yeah, the wealth of knowledge, I just love the fact that we have an opportunity of having so much resource available to us.
And there is quite a few bits for people to get started there that you shared. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
Amazing. And where people can connect with you if they want to stay close to you and what you're doing, what you're building?
Sharon Johal on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Thanks very much. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.